Okay, so this is a book about actually a serf family, although they don't actually use that word in here. But that's what was going on in this book. And Harold and the Giant Knight. And let's see, let's talk for a minute about elements of literature. Every story has certain elements. We call them character, conflict, character setting, conflict, plot, and theme. And so I want you to be thinking while we're reading this about who the main character is, what the setting is for the story. That's the world of the story that the author creates. Okay? Every author creates a world for their book. And at the beginning of the book, they always open the door and invite you into the world. And you get to find out a little bit about the world of the story before the author lets you know what the problem is going to be that has to be solved during the story. And that problem that is solved during the story is called, does anybody remember? I think we've talked about this maybe a couple of times. You remember what?
Climax?
Well, that's part of the plot. The conflict is what we call is the problem of the story. Okay. So usually at the beginning of the story, the author invites you in, you get to meet the characters, you get to find out what kind of world and situation they're in. And then once all that's settled, then the problem comes up. Okay. And that's what we call the conflict. You can see this chart on page 53, but it's not filled in. I do have a story chart, however, that's posted accidentally on class 2, whereas the one we read last week is posted on class 3. I need to switch those for this story. And so the climax, Vance, is the part where the problem is about to get solved. That's usually the most exciting part of the story. And in between when the conflict is introduced and the problem is solved, we have what we call the rising action. That's where the character says and thinks and does things to try to solve the problem. Okay? So I want you to be listening while we are reading this and figure out who the main character is, a little bit about the setting, the world of the story, and what the problem is. And then where the climax is, where the most exciting part of the story is, where the problem is on the verge of getting solved. The problem doesn't always get solved. Either the character solves the problem or they fail to solve the problem. But in any case, when the climax is over, the problem is over. Okay? Whether it's solved or not. Of course, the best stories are the ones where the character actually does solve the problem, right? So let's read Harold and the Giant Knight. And this is a book by Donald Carrick. And he really has a lot of historical details in this book, which make it very enjoyable. He did a lot of research for this book. This is an old library book that I bought off of Amazon, so I could have my own copy. Okay. Harold lived with his mother Helga and his father Walter in the valley which spread beneath the castle. The valley was owned by a baron who lived in the castle, surrounded by his knights. All the farmers in the valley had to give the baron part of their crops. He, in turn, allowed them to farm his land. Harold's family had farmed the same land for as long as anyone could remember. Harold's father was a weaver as well as a farmer. He wove eel traps, screens, hats, fences, chairs, and every manner of basket. So there's Harold. It's spelled a little bit differently than we spell Harold. We usually spell Harold in English, H-A-R-O-L-D, and apparently this is a German spelling. I looked it up. So what does that give you a clue where this might possibly be happening?
In Germany?
Yeah, exactly. There's the castle up there, and you can see the thatched roof of this cottage here. So we got Harold, Helga. Helga's a good German name. And Walter. And what does Walter do for his second job besides farming? He's a weaver. A weaver of baskets, actually. So one spring morning, Harold climbed up to the castle with baskets his father had woven for the castle kitchen. Harold went to the castle as often as he could. After he delivered the baskets, he wandered through the passageways, exploring the wondrous stone chambers. Many were larger than his whole home. Harold was especially fond of the Baron's knights. Knights were different from other folk. They were huge, scarred men who wore leather and metal clothes covered by bright tunics. The knights spoke with deep voices, and their clothing creaked and clanked as they walked by. Harold burned to be one of them. I think these are supposed to be the knights right there. So these castles were kind of like small cities inside.
Yeah.
Or some were larger than others, but this is something really interesting here. This, I believe, is supposed to be the Baron, and the Baron is holding a bird on his finger. If you've ever read much about knights in the Middle Ages, does anybody have an idea of what kind of bird that might be?
Parrot.
A messenger bird.
That's a good guess. It could be a messenger. Only noblemen were allowed to own falcons, and they would hunt with them. So that's probably a falcon of some sort there. Or it could be probably a falcon. Have either one of y'all ever read My Side of the Mountain?
No.
The boy in that book actually captures a peregrine falcon and trains it to hunt. Harold loved the jousts when two knights fought. Best of all were the tournaments. Then he could watch all the Baron's knights clash with all the knights from another castle in a mock battle. Nothing made Harold happier than to see the galloping horses and the swirling banners and to hear the clang of sword against shield. On this particular morning, the Baron announced that it was time to begin training for the summer tournaments. A great cheer went up from the knights. They were restless after the long winter they had spent inside the castle. As Harold walked home, he wished he could train with them. Okay, so we know a little bit about the world of the story now. We know about Harold and his family. We know about the knights and the Baron and the castle. And what does Harold wish he could do?
Be a knight.
Train with them.
Yeah, and ultimately be one, right? The next morning, a terrible racket woke Harold. He ran outside to find his father in a fit. Men from the castle were swarming all over their farm. Horns blew, kettle drums boomed, tents were going up. "What's happening?" Harold asked. "The knights' regular practice fields are flooded, so they've come here to train," his father said. Watched as knights strutted about, shouting 1,000 orders. "We're ruined," groaned Walter. "With all this foolish practice on our fields, how can we plant the spring crops?" His father looks like he's in despair, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Harold understood how his father felt. Without a harvest, his family would have no food and could not pay the Baron for the use of his land. But at the same time, it was Harold's dream come true. All the knights were right here on his family's farm.
Yeah, he doesn't look very sad about it.
Walter's fields transformed into a jousting area in which knights galloped about on large horses and practiced with their lances. Since no farming could be done, Harold spent all his time at the knights' camp. Soon he was helping with the horses and tending the fires. Perhaps there was a chance for him to become a knight after all. So I'm just realizing here that my story chart may be a little bit off. I think Harold's conflict is that he wants to become a knight. I'll have to change my story chart a little bit. I had a different problem, but I think that's just all part of Harold wanting to become a knight. Let's see. The knight's presence changed everything on the farm. There were no more eggs to collect because the constant noise caused the chickens to stop laying. The pigs grew nervous and lost weight. Harald could not believe it when the knights tested their swords by chopping into his father's carefully tended fruit trees. The stone boundary fences his grandfather had built were broken and scattered. Wow, these guys are really a menace, aren't they?
Although it does make sense since there's basically a hierarchy and they basically can do whatever they want if it involves anyone lower than them.
Exactly. The knights had huge appetites. To fill the camp cook pots, they simply took what they wanted from Walter and the other valley farmers. Chickens, ducks, pigs, and goats disappeared in their stew pots on the roasting spits. Harald was shocked. He had always thought knights were strong, brave men who spent their time helping people. Instead, he saw them ruin the land and plunder the farm like thieves. Walter was pleased when Harald announced one day that he was no longer going to the camp. Harald had lost his taste for the knightly life. Now, I think I still have the right problem identified. To save what little food they had left, Helga gathered it together and put it in a sack. When it was dark, Harald went with his father to hide it. They carried the food down a small path past the knight's camp to a secret cave. Harald had discovered the cave one day last summer while he was picking berries. They hid the food on a high ledge. When they returned home, no one could sleep, so they sat together around their small fire. There seemed to be no answer to their problem. That's the clue that that's the main conflict, okay? If I were big, I'd thrash all the knights and send them running, said Harald. It's the only thing they understand. No one is big enough to do that, answered Helga, except another knight. Walter said nothing, but his hands began weaving. The giant shadows his father cast on the wall gave Harald an idea. I know how we can get rid of the knights, he said. His father stopped weaving. What do you mean, son? He asked. Well, why can't we make a knight to frighten them? And just how would we do that, Harald? Asked Helga. Father is a master weaver, isn't he? He can weave anything. Why can't he weave a giant knight? A smile spread over Walter's face. Let's hear more, he said. Excitedly, they talked late into the night as an idea led to idea. By morning, they had a plan.
Gonna be a Trojan horse.
Something like. Okay, so what's their problem? Their problem is, will they be able to do what?
Survive and get rid of the knight.
Yes, exactly. From the next day on, Harold's family spent all their time at the cave, weaving their giant. Harald made trip after trip to the cave, bringing Walter great bundles of reeds. One afternoon, rabbit hunters from the camp almost discovered the cave as Harald was about to enter. Where are you bound with that bundle, lad? Called the leader, coming closer. Harald knew that once the dogs got near the entrance to the cave, all would be lost. Oh, I'm on my way to build a rabbit hutch, he replied, thinking quickly. Rabbits? What rabbits? Demanded the hunters. The rabbits in the thicket down the ravine. It's full of them, said Harald. Well, lad, we'll just take a look at this thicket of yours, said the leader, and the hunters marched off. Well, that was close.
I'd like to point out that I think they could probably get together with the others here and just hide all of the food.
Yeah, but they can't plant any new crops.
Yeah, but if there's no food to be planted,
Well,
then they would leave. Well, if there's no food there, then the knights will leave.
Well, that's true. With each bundle of Harald's reeds, the basket knight grew larger. Harald was very proud of his father's skill. He was sure nothing this large had ever been woven. By daylight, he will probably look rather patchy, Walter said, but by night, after the knights have finished drinking and are asleep, our knight should be very frightening. Helga decided to make a cape for him. Finally, the giant basket knight was finished. He was almost too large to squeeze through the cave entrance. Carefully, they mounted the creature on Patience, their old plow horse, and tied it down. Walter led Patience down the narrow trail. The knight looked huge, but weighed so little that each draft from the valley caught it like a sail. Harald clung to a rope to steady the creature. At one spot, the trees were so close they almost pushed the basket knight off Patience's back. When the knight swayed back and forth, it looked even more ghost-like. "These paths were not made for giants," Harald whispered. Each small farm along the way had a dog that barked as the giant drew near. Harald started to shiver. What if they were discovered? Fortunately, no one woke. When they arrived at the edge of the camp, the knights were all asleep. It was Harald's task to enter the camp and untie the horses. He slipped quietly past the tents full of snoring knights. By day, he knew the camp, but by night, it all seemed different. One mistake could ruin everything. At last, he found the horses and with trembling hands untied the knots. The free horses began to wander through the camp. There's Harald running for his life. In the light of the early moon, Harald saw the giant loom above the trees. The moment he appeared, Walter and Helga began a horrific clamor. She clanged pots while he made loud moaning sounds through a long wooden tube. That was the signal for Harald to dart from tent to tent, pulling up tent pegs. One after another, the tents collapsed on top of the sleeping knights. The bewildered knights awoke in the dark, blanketed by the heavy tents. As they groped free, they tripped over ropes and cracked their shins on tent poles. Once they were in the open, the mob of bruised, half-clothed knights were startled by the sight of the giant. It seemed to be walking over the trees, and it began to shout at them in a deep, creaky voice. "Away with you! Away from the graves of my forefathers! Begone, all of you, before the new day dawns!" Then suddenly, the swaying knights seemed to disappear from the sky. The frightened knights were left standing in the shambles of the camp. Actually, the giant had fallen from Patience's back, and she trotted away, dragging him behind. Harald caught up with his parents, who were close on Patience's heels. They were busy picking up the bits and pieces that were falling from the giant. There was no time to wonder if their plan had worked until they reached the cave. Dumbfounded, the knights milled about in the camp, gathering their wits and their horses. No trace of the ghostly knight could be found. No one wanted to mention the ghost warning, but one knight had the courage to say, "This camp is a wreck. I think it's time to leave." "Let's go back to the castle," said a second. A great sigh of relief came from all sides. Not one knight wanted to stay on and risk seeing the giant again. Shortly after sunrise, Harald, Helga, and Walter watched the band of knights make their way slowly up the hill toward the castle. Helga and Walter hugged each other and cried with relief. Helga and Walter hugged each other and cried with relief. Harald, who could not contain himself, jumped for joy. After a great deal of work, the three of them cleared their fields and planted crops. That fall, their harvest was not as big as usual, but it was enough to pay the baron and feed themselves through the winter. The next spring, Harald and his father were planting once again. "Listen to what the wind brings us from down the valley," said Walter. They could hear a faint clanging from the knights at practice on the baron's field. This time, they were but pleasant tinkles to Harald's ears. Nearby stood a familiar figure. It was a scarecrow, fashioned from the giant's reeds. As it turned with the wind, it almost seemed to smile. The end. Okay. You ever get a copy of this book, you have time to sit and look at all the little details and the pictures. They're pretty amazing. One thing that worked in Helga and Walter and Harald's favor is that people in the Middle Ages tended to be very superstitious. So if a giant ghostly knight appeared and said that he was coming back to get them if they didn't get off the fields of his forefathers, they probably would believe that. People believed in ghosts and witches and all that sort of thing a lot of the time in the Middle Ages. So where's the climax of the story? Where's the most exciting part where the problem's about to be solved, either successfully or failed to be solved? Where does that happen in the story?
When the night comes to when the weeb knight comes to the knight's camp and starts scaring them, and then Precious falls and the knight falls.
Exactly. Now, if you look at that little chart on your page on 53, the next thing that happens after the climax and the problem is solved or it isn't is what we call the denouement. That's a French word, and it means the unraveling. And so it's what happens after the problem. So what happened after the problem? What did they wake up and see the next morning?
The knight's leaving.
The knight's leaving, so that's the denouement. And then we get to the conclusion, and that's how things either go back to normal like they're supposed to be, or somehow something has changed. So what happens in this case?
The main character no longer wants to be a knight.
Right. And things have gone back to normal in that they actually get to do their planting and their farm is peaceful once again, right? So
Yeah.
Great job, you guys. So that's how you analyze a story. And I had a girl in level 1. We spent some time doing story analysis in level 1 after Christmas. And she went to a private Christian school this year. And one of the first things that she had to do in English class at that school was something along the lines of a story chart, figure out all the parts of the story. And she had spent time studying stories and writing some stories last year in level 1, and she knew right away how to do it. So she felt really good about that, starting a new school and, everything's strange and different. So learning how to analyze stories comes in really handy in English classes. So we'll be doing one of these each class time. The next one we're going to do is about it's a really neat story about a bully in a school, and you'll see what the paragraph we're going to keyword outline has to do with that next week.